Welcome to this EMS web training session. In this session, we're going to be talking about creating poems and milestones. Each poem and milestone is typically related to a finding. Poems can also be created under objectives and targets, and also independent poems can be created, although those are pretty rare. So in this training session, we're going to be talking about the most common usage of poems, and that's attaching it to a finding and how it fits in the finding review process for closing out the finding. So a finding can have a new poem created specifically for it, or it can be linked to an existing poem. So a single poem can be linked to multiple findings. So the things we'll cover in this training session then include how to create a poem, what the process is in getting a poem approved, and then how to update various fields. Some of the fields depend upon the status of the poem, such as the target date, and then how to complete and get the poem completed. So we're going to attach this poem to an existing finding. Under the Audit Poems tab, under the Audit Inspections, you can see all of the existing audit poems, and you can also see what findings there are that should have a poem but do not yet have a poem. So you could scroll through and look for the finding that you want and click on it. That does not have a poem. Or you can navigate to the Finding tab and then find the finding that you want that does not have a poem. And so in this case, we're going to look at this improper storage of universal waste lamps finding. So to determine whether or not a finding requires a poem, it has to go through the assign process. So the lead auditor has the ability to assign this finding, and so that defines the closure review POC, the resolution target date, so we'll put down like March 29th in 2 weeks, and that can be updated later by the finding POC. So the important thing here is these two checkboxes. So it's whether a poem is required and whether a formal review is required. So we're going to mark both of them and save it. So on the finding, we have this poem/kappa subtab. And so if we click on that, that will show us the current poem and kappa information. So there is no poem for this, so we can either create one or link this finding to an existing poem. So if I want to link it to an existing poem, I click on that link, and then I can search for the name of an existing poem. So I'm going to look for a poem or finding with the name of example in the title. And then if I click on a example poem, and then I can submit it and say, yes, I do want to link to this poem. And then that poem is now linked to this finding. And so you can see that all of the information for this poem is now linked to these poems. Okay, so now I'm going to go back to the original finding, my improper storage of universal waste lamps. And that was finding number 2019 F-1. So now I'm going to go back to my kappa, and my poem. And this time I'm going to deactivate the poem. Or actually, what I want to do is I want to remove this poem. And that is only available to organization administrators. So what I'm going to do then is I'm going to open up a new tab, and I'm going to switch user accounts. And I'm going to switch to my main account, which is an organization administrator account. And now I'm going to refresh that page. So now as an organization administrator, and every organization has a user account with the organization administrator, I can now delink this poem from this finding. So because this is not something we want users to mistakenly do, we limit it only to the organization administrators. Okay, so now for this improper storage of universal waste lamps, it no longer has a finding linked, or a poem linked to it. So I'm going to create a poem now from scratch for this finding. So I'm going to put it down an appropriate poem name. So I'm going to say proper hazmat storage and labeling. Okay, the plan of action and synopsis. Properly label all HW, ensure satisfactory housekeeping maintenance for all containers. Okay, you can identify who the POAM manager is. So I am going to select a POAM manager. Let's see. Oops. I'll make the Atlantis Auditor the POAM manager. And then you can select a target date through the calendar, or type in a value. So I'm going to say June 1st, 2019. The completion date, you can fill out once it's actually completed. And you can upload a document. You can notify the lead auditor whenever changes are made to this POAM, if you mark the checkbox. And so this will fire off an automated email saying, hey, something's changed this poem. So usually you don't do that unless there's something important changing that the lead auditor needs to be aware of. And if you want to, you can share this poem with sub-organizations. And that will allow the child organizations to be able to link findings to this poem. So I'm going to go ahead and save this poem. And so I'm able to enter in POAM information and CAPA information, corrective and preventive actions. So I'm going to click on Edit CAPA, and I'm going to fill out these text boxes for my corrective and for preventive actions. So corrective action is properly label all as waste and ensure satisfactory housekeeping maintenance for all containers. For preventive action, I'm going to say add this site to the site visit list, conduct quarterly inspections for the remainder of FY19. So that way I can check up on this particular site and make sure that they're not repeating this finding. Note any deficiencies as encountered. Okay, so I've entered in the CAPA information. Now let's create some milestones. So typically you create a milestone for each action that needs to take place. So I'm going to create my first milestone, conduct site inspection and confirm specific containers in need of proper labeling were enacted. Okay, so we're going to make sure that the corrective action got taken care of, and let's say we give them a month to do that. So the progress is 0, it's not completed yet, so save milestone. So we'll add in a couple more milestones. We'll add in a milestone to determine the proper storage or proper labeling for each container. Target date. So those are the only two mandatory fields, and I'll save this one. And we'll make one more milestone. Conduct follow-up quarterly site visit. So all of our milestones correspond to what we said we were going to do in our corrective and preventive actions. Okay, so one thing that we're going to want to do is, if this is under a formal review process, then we want the POAM to get approved by the lead auditor or the closure review POC. If this was not under formal review, then a approved POAM is not necessary, and we could just keep the POAM status as POAM under development. But because this is under formal review, we're going to request that the POAM is ready for review. So this fires off an automated email, and that would go to the lead auditor, the closure review POC, and they would be able to review the POAM and look at it, and if they concurred, they would change the status to POAM approved. Now, to change the progress of the POAM, you change or update the milestones. So let's say we'll fast forward a couple of months and say that these 2 items were completed. So this is a special table in EMS Web as indicated by these green fields, which means that these fields can be updated on the fly without having to go into each milestone and edit them. So I can just click into this box, say this is now 100%, and then click outside of the box. And now that's been updated. So let's say both of these got completed. We conducted, let's say, a quarterly site visit with 2 more to go. So we'll say it's 33% done. Now, when we refresh this page, the progress gets updated to be a simple average of the milestones. When the progress gets to 100% complete, and let me do that by just updating this last milestone to 100%, and then the next time I come to this page or refresh the page, the progress changes to 100%, and we see that the POAM has now been completed with the current date that it was completed. So the date and time that the last milestone got set to 100%. Okay, and so that at that point then the POAM is completed. Once the lead auditor or closure review POC reviews the POAM, the status would be set to approved. If they saw that the progress was 100%, they could set the status to POAM completed. One last thing that you can do to this POAM is you can add a document to the POAM. So I'm going to attach an existing document to this POAM. So here I would see all of the folders and subfolders as found under the Documents tab, and then I can select any existing document. So if I select a document and then attach selected, then it becomes attached to that POAM. And then note that I can do the same thing for a milestone. If I go into a specific milestone, there are various things that I can edit for that milestone. So one thing is I can add an action. So I can say, site visit was performed on 4/1/2019, and click the Add button. So this is just a way of giving status updates. I can also add related documents to it. So if on that site visit I took a picture that showed the properly labeled containers at that site visit, I could upload it. In this example, I'm just going to pick any file and attach it. So you can have documents attached to individual milestones. You can have documents attached to the POAM itself. So when we look at the POAM, under related items, we see now that there's one POAM document, and then we can see that there's one document attached to this specific milestone. So if you wanted to see the documents, it's just one click away. If I go back to the finding, under related items, I can see the documents that were related to that finding, the documents related to that POAM, or to that individual milestone. And so you can reach all of the documents that are related to any milestone, POAM, or finding all in this one area. Okay, so one other thing to note under this POAM is that when I edit this POAM, I can change the target date. So if my target date got pushed out, I can do so. But if the status of the POAM was POAM approved, so it got approved by the lead auditor or closure review POC, then I would not be able to update the target date. What I would have to do is either contact the lead auditor or closure review POC and ask them to update the target date, or I would have to change the status back to ready for review and then update the target date. Either way, the lead auditor is aware of the situation that the target date is changing and has to approve of that change.